Hey, welcome back everyone. First off, some breaking news. More disasters are taking place across China where heavy rains are going on 39 days and floods are sweeping through 26 provinces and cities. In Guizhou Province, villages were partially buried by a large landslide from the TongRedn mountain. On early morning July 8th, a landslide in Sichuan village. 4 villages were affected. 133 households were damaged and 500 people were impacted. Locals there told the Epoch Times in interviews, quote, "The village was buried, only 3 or 4 houses have not yet collapsed. Many people have no signs of life when they are dug out of the mud, and some people were washed away by the flood. Thousands of acres of farmland were flooded." And close to 3 miles away from that, locals also said the main roads were washed away, and a nearby mountain called the Fendongling Mountain also started to crack. Many residents there were also evacuated. And in Hubei Province, the embankment of the Jingzhou River at Huanggan Wu Cave in Hubei broke. The breach in the embankment is about 131 feet long, and it affected about 4 villages. More than 6,000 residents and at least 10,000 acres of farmland were also impacted. And also in Huanggang, there was a sudden landslide in Huangmei County. 9 people from 5 different households were buried, and of them, 8 of them were killed. In JianXi Province, meanwhile, close to 9,000 villagers were evacuated when a local dike broke. The break was about 164 feet long. Close to 2,470 acres of farmland were also affected there. Also in Jiangxi in Qinghua Town, the famous 800-year-old bridge known as the Rainbow Bridge was washed away by floods. In Zhejiang Province, meanwhile, officials opened all 9 of the spillways in the Sichuan River Dam reservoir, and this was due to its water levels rising above the threshold due to the floods again. Now, the Chinese regime, meanwhile, has acknowledged a similar disaster to that at the Hangzhou reservoir. Water discharges impacted close to 300,000 people and submerged about 12 villages. And at the Three Gorges Dam, again, where a lot of focus is right now, waters are still being discharged non-stop. The Yangtze River Water Resources Commission predicts that heavy rainfall will continue in that area in the middle and lower reaches of the Yangtze River in the next few days. And the water level may continue to rise in addition to that. And the highest levels are expected to exceed the warning levels by several feet. And in Sichuan Province, in addition to all these other disasters, a fireworks factory exploded. 7,100 people were evacuated, and local authorities claimed 6 people were injured. Many Chinese netizens, however, have raised doubts about the Chinese Communist Party's numbers, given that videos of the explosion and of the aftermath show that several blocks and most nearby homes were almost completely destroyed. Now, the fireworks factory known as the Guanghan Jinyan Fireworks Co. Ltd. was located in Yuansheng Village, Guangshan of Sichuan. And meanwhile, a couple updates from Hong Kong. There's talk now in Hong Kong of possibly locking down the city once again amid this new coronavirus surge. And of course, in Hong Kong, this has other connotations. In Hong Kong, this is being interpreted as local authorities putting in new measures to prevent them from going on the streets and protesting. Because the Chinese Communist Party just recently implemented these new national security laws, and Hong Kongers have been protesting against that. Now, the new lockdowns are seen as a sign of the Chinese Communist Party using the, say, smokescreen of this virus to prevent people from going out and protesting while it implements this new law. And meanwhile, many other countries are standing up against the CCP and its new forms of suppression in Hong Kong. In Australia, for example, they're now granting Hong Kong people who are working and studying in Australia 5 years of residency, and they're also able to apply for permanent residence. This is in addition to talk, for example, in the United Kingdom of offering paths to citizenship for different Hong Kongers looking to escape China as they begin implementing these new laws, and also talk in the United States of doing the same thing. And the Chinese Communist Party is fighting back against this on all fronts. They're accusing other countries, including Australia, including the UK, of interfering in their own internal affairs. But of course, in Hong Kong, they're supposed to have this agreement, 1 country, 2 systems. Hong Kong is supposed to have autonomy, and that was part of the agreement in it being handed over from the UK to the Chinese regime. Hong Kong is supposed to be relatively independent. And so again, this is a picture of what's happening in Hong Kong, and of the CCP trying to lock down the protests, prevent people from leaving the country. And a quick news update in the United States as well. The Trump administration has launched a new program to fight against violent crime surges in some U.S. cities, first of all focused on Kansas City. And it's giving federal reinforcements to help out in these local areas. They're calling it Operation Legend. Attorney General William Barr said this, quote, Operation Legend will combine federal and local resources to combat the disturbing uptick in violence by surging federal agents and other federal assets into cities like Kansas City, a city currently experiencing its worst homicide rate in its history. And this is amid different concerns across the United States in mostly major cities of law enforcement having its hands tied behind its backs by these different political movements now being used to defund the police and make pushbacks against law enforcement. And now with that said, let's jump into the broader stories for today. Now first off, FBI Director Christopher Wray is warning about threats of the Chinese Communist Party on the U.S. economy and national security.
The greatest long-term threat to our nation's information and intellectual property and to our economic vitality is the counterintelligence and economic espionage threat from China. It's a threat to our economic security and, by extension, to our national security.
He also stated that if you're an American adult, it is more likely than not that China has stolen your personal data. And you might remember we explained this in a previous episode, talking about how the Chinese Communist Party has built a database on Americans.
We've now reached the point where the FBI is opening a new China-related counterintelligence case about every 10 hours. Of the nearly 5,000 active FBI counterintelligence cases currently underway across the country, almost half are all related to China.
And at this very moment, China is working to compromise American healthcare organizations, pharmaceutical companies, and academic institutions conducting essential COVID-19 research. And so what's the significance of that? The Chinese Communist Party is waging what they call an unrestricted war against the United States. The Chinese Communist Party regards America as its #1 global competitor, and it views itself and its own goals as being meant to replace the United States as the world leader. They want to, in their terms, replace the U.S. model of governance with the China model of governance. Things like the One Belt, One Road initiative, they're part of this. Things like information operations are part of this. Economic theft is part of this. Drug warfare, like fentanyl, like these synthetic drugs in our streets, are part of this. They call it drug warfare. Its takeover of Hollywood would be called culture warfare. It's part of this. All the different pieces we see from China targeting the United States are part of a broader strategy of the CCP. And now we see Christopher Wray saying the United States is stepping up to do something about it. In other news, a Chinese military-linked company has defaulted on about 2 billion renminbi, which is about $285 million in bonds. And this is raising questions about the real state of the Chinese economy. I'll explain this. Now, first off, the company, which is called Huanxun Arc Group, also called CCT Group, defaulted on the bonds on July 2nd. A CCT subsidiary and a listed company, CCT Joint Stock Company, is a specialized military-industrial enterprise. Huanxun Arc Group announced on Chinese social media site Sina, quote, the company failed to raise sufficient funds before the interest repayment date on July 2nd, and explained that it was unable to pay the interest on the bond. Now, the default on that bond will also trigger a similar default on 4 related bonds with a combined total of around 1.5 billion yuan, or about $220 million. Now, CCT Group was established in 2007 and is headquartered in Zhenjiang City in Guangdong Province. Its CEO is named Fan Hu and is a former senior vice president of Chinese communications company ZTE, which has recently been a focus of controversy again. Now, I'll explain the bigger issues with ZTE in just a minute, but going a bit more into this company itself. According to the CCT Group website, the company is involved in military communications, and it operates in places including Beijing, Wuhan, the epicenter of this coronavirus, Hong Kong, and elsewhere. And despite its military ties, the company's annual report for 2019 shows that it lost more than 1.5 billion yuan, or about $210 million. Now, the company's stocks were suspended for a day, and after it resumed trading on June 16, it fell consecutively for more than 2 weeks by over 34%, which impacted about 60,000 traders. And there's also some suspicion that something more may be involved in this. You might remember some of the different issues that have been seen with Chinese companies listed on the stock exchanges. I'll explain this. When the company issued an audit report, 2 independent directors of the company issued a statement saying they cannot guarantee the truthfulness, accuracy, or completeness of the information. Also, 3 executives of CCT Group have resigned this year. In April, 3 of its independent directors resigned together. In March, its director and chair of the board resigned. And in late January, its secretary of the board resigned. Now, part of this may be tied to a move from the United States, which placed restrictions on companies with ties to the Chinese military. Now, on June 30, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC in the United States, formally listed Huawei Technologies and ZTE, which is tied to the head of this company, as national security threats to the United States, and prohibited the use of government funds to purchase from them. FCC Chairman Ajit Pai said this, quote, "Both companies have close ties to the Chinese Communist Party and China's military apparatus, and both companies are broadly subject to Chinese law obligating them to cooperate with the country's intelligence services." And he continued stating this, "We cannot and will not allow the Chinese Communist Party to exploit network vulnerabilities and compromise our critical communications infrastructure." Now, the incident of this company ties not just to possible financial troubles for the Chinese military companies, but to the broader financial situation in China overall. The Chinese stock market recently surged as the CCP used its state media to lure investors back to China. Yet public reporting suggests that financial situation in China is in much greater trouble than what the CCP is leading the world to believe. Now, as we reported just recently, the Chinese Communist Party made an unprecedented move late last month by forcing banks and investors to give up $212 billion. Why would the Chinese Communist Party claim the situation for investment is right now ripe in China, when it just forced its investors to sacrifice their profits for the regime? Now, reporting at the time that they did this said the CCP was trying to rebound from the virus and was facing its worst economic downturn in 40 years. And that contradicts what it is right now saying to lure investors into China. And just recently, the Chinese Communist Party's central bank called on struggling corporate bond issuers to seek measures to prevent holders from defaulting. Such intervention increases the uncertainties on whether investors could ever recoup their money. And so, in other words, again, the Chinese Communist Party is making moves right now that, according to South China Morning Post, could mean investors never recoup their money. They never get their money back. And at the same time, the Chinese Communist Party is telling investors in the United States and other parts of the world, come to China, the environment is ripe for your investment. Also, the WHO has acknowledged evidence submitted by a group of scientists on the possible airborne spread of the CCP virus, this new coronavirus. And what's the significance of that? Basically, right now in the United States and many parts of the U.S., including in New York, for example, companies are trying to enter their 3rd phase of opening. This means that schools might be able to reopen. It means businesses might be able to reopen. It means that indoor dining might be able to start again. One of the big concerns about doing that is whether indoor spaces can help the virus spread. Now, that document that was sent to the WHO by these different scientists claimed that this virus is airborne, meaning that internal spaces, inside, indoor spaces, are more ripe to spread the virus because the virus can linger in the air.
We have to be open to this evidence and understand its implications regarding the modes of transmission and also regarding the precautions that need to be taken.
Now, if the WHO is adopting that, or at least recognizing that there's some credibility in their reporting, it means that different governors may use this to again bring back some of these lockdowns, or at the very least keep the lockdowns they currently have in place. And at the same time, the Chinese Communist Party is now lashing out at the United States for pulling out of the World Health Organization. So the Chinese Communist Party's foreign ministry spokesperson said this. He claimed the WHO is, quote, the most authoritative and professional international institution in the field of global public health security. And again, he's criticizing the U.S. for pulling out of the WHO. But the context of why the United States pulled out of the WHO is important here. And the Chinese Communist Party coming out to defend the WHO is also important here as well. The United States had determined through a study that the WHO could not demonstrate its independence from the Chinese Communist Party. In other words, during the whole outbreak of this virus, the WHO was acting as a mouthpiece of the CCP. And now the CCP itself is coming out to defend the WHO when the United States pulls out. Now moving on, Sunday Times is reporting that a virus similar to the CCP virus, this new coronavirus, had been sent to Wuhan, the epicenter of the virus, back in 2013. This report details how Chinese scientists discovered this virus in an abandoned mine, where even then it was linked to several deaths from a coronavirus-type respiratory illness. Again, leading to suspicions, supporting the different suspicions, that very likely this new virus we're seeing could have leaked from a lab in Wuhan, but had a natural origin. In other words, this laboratory in Wuhan, they have two different laboratories there, were studying viruses exactly like this. Now, of course, different media have reported on possible security breaches and concerns at these laboratories. And so a possible virus leak from these labs is not unheard of and also not something we should write off. Now we're seeing additional research suggesting that a virus very much like the one we're facing right now had been brought to that laboratory, brought to one of those laboratories back in 2013. And meanwhile, in Australia, locals are raising concerns over the Chinese Communist Party's increased control over rare earth minerals, which are tied to its global high-tech markets. Now, the Sydney Morning Herald is reporting this, quote, according to Professor Kingsnorth, China is on a quest to sell end products rather than precursor materials. And to do that, it is manipulating prices by tinkering with taxes and quotas, which is subsequently strangling investment in Australia's critical mineral projects. And this has been something that has been ongoing. This is an ongoing concern, not just for Australia, but for many countries. And I'll explain why this matters. Now, jumping all the way back to 2010, China blocked exports of rare earth minerals to Japan. This was seen as a move to attack Japan's high-tech markets. It was done in context of these territorial disputes over these disputed islands between Japan and China, which had really sparked around that time. And jumping to just last year, China is threatening to cut rare earth supplies to the United States. And this is amid ongoing concerns over possible national security risks on what would happen if China began doing the same thing to the United States what it had done to Japan back in 2010. Now, on July 5th, Epoch Times had a story stating this: the United States is vulnerable to China's rare earth monopoly. And it reported this, quote, Beijing aims to make the United States directly and indirectly dependent on China for critical minerals and REEs, these rare earth minerals. And it cites this China scholar and Horizon Advisory co-founder. It continues, quote, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, has been focused on rare earths for as long as it has existed, which attributes to that individual. And Chinese sources explicitly treat rare earths as tools of power and coercion in today's globalized industrial systems. This orientation rests on China's military-civil fusion strategy. Beijing weaponizes integration into open, cooperative global systems for offensive ends. In other words, it is using these for offensive actions tied to its military. And it continues, quote, the United States, its allies, and its partners need to jointly recognize as much and respond to scale. Now, this Australian article just recently shows that the Chinese Communist Party is taking steps to do this right now as we speak. When it comes to the Chinese Communist Party's different doctrines on warfare, the unrestricted warfare doctrine, for example, this is what they would call resource warfare. Now, what is one of the main goals of communism? Seize the means of production. Who controls the natural resources of every given country? Who controls the GDP products of a given country? Who controls mining in Australia? Who controls the dairy industry in, say, New Zealand? Who controls the different manufacturing bases in the United States and other countries? Well, the Chinese Communist Party is making significant efforts to do that. If the Chinese Communist Party can gain control over these different resources, it can then begin manipulating prices to push out competitors from these markets. And as these different concerns in Australia are now showing, the CCP appears to be doing just that. It is restricting access to these markets, to these products, from other investors and so on, while using them to prop up its own goals to sell end products to users. And again, these rare earth minerals are fundamental core pieces of many high-tech products. Now, meanwhile, the Journal of Advanced Military Studies has a report stating that the main focus of the Chinese military is on political warfare. And it says the United States, quote, no longer has the capacity to compete and win on the political warfare battlefield. And it says this has only been the case over the close to 3 decades since the end of the Cold War. Now, the report says this: to successfully confront this threat, the United States must relearn how to fight on the political warfare battlefield. And it says, although increasingly capable militarily, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, employs political warfare as its primary weapon to destroy its adversaries. Political warfare employs all means of a nation's command, short of war. In other words, things pushed right to the brink of what would constitute war, but never crossing that line, to achieve its national objectives. These means range from overt actions such as political alliances, economic measures, and public diplomacy, to covert operations including coercion, disinformation, psychological warfare, assassination, criminal activities, violent attacks, and support for proxy armies and insurgencies. And we should note that on every single one of those points, we've seen cases of the Chinese Communist Party doing that in the United States and other countries around the world. Now, just as a few examples of this, when it talks about political alliances, we see this being done against India right now, where the Chinese Communist Party is using its alliances with Nepal to put pressure on India, Nepal and Pakistan. When it comes to economic measures, we see them doing this in Africa right now, we see them doing this in Latin America right now very heavily. We also see them using their economic leverage in places like Australia to coerce local politics. When it comes to public diplomacy, the Chinese Communist Party has its new wolf warrior form of diplomacy, this very aggressive form of diplomacy. When it comes to covert operations, we can look at things like its cyber theft. We can look at things like Operation Fox Hunt, which actually FBI Director Christopher Wray just mentioned, where the Chinese Communist Party is carrying out arrests of Chinese officials even on American soil. We can look at issues of coercion, of disinformation, of psychological warfare, assassination. Those are hard to prove, but the Chinese Communist Party does have different operations for that. For example, again, Operation Fox Hunt. One thing Christopher Wray just mentioned is that when the Chinese Communist Party sends its agents to find these escaped Chinese officials in the United States, sometimes U.S. citizens, it tries to pressure them, if it cannot find them, to either turn themselves in or commit suicide. And they use different forms of pressure to make them do so. There's criminal activities, such as the Chinese Communist Party's control over these different Chinese mafia organizations, the triads, through its United Front Work Department and its control of the Tongs, which run these operations. Through its influence over the drug cartels, by, for example, supplying precursor chemicals, by supplying synthetic drugs, to violent attacks like we've seen them doing in Hong Kong and in Taiwan against different dissidents. When it mentions here using proxy armies and insurgencies, the Chinese Communist Party is being accused of doing that right now in Myanmar. And so yes, on every one of these grounds, the Chinese Communist Party is engaged, and they are extremely aggressive in doing so. With that said, folks, again, we're broadcasting Monday through Friday, 5 days a week, and also we're now on cable. So if you want to find us on cable, check in the description below. We'll have information on that. We're on NTD America, a new channel just launched. And again, folks, if you want to show your support for this channel, please join our Patreon. We have a link to that in the description below as well. And every Sunday, I'll do a live Q&A for our Patreon supporters. And of course, folks, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.